Dust rattles down from the wooden ceiling beams of a plaster-dusted Rhineland wine cellar as heavy German artillery impacts near the Oppenheim River crossing in March 1945. 23-year-old Corporal Theodore Palluck sits crouched over a crude plank table, a silver St. Christopher medal on a piece of green paracord swaying softly against his wool shirt with every incoming concussion. A close shell impact violently shakes the subterranean stone foundation, knocking his heavy radio receiver straight off the splintered wooden edge. Without lifting his eyes from his yellow notepad, Palluck shoots out his left arm, catches the falling set with his bare hand, and continues relaying crucial target coordinates into his mouthpiece without missing a single beat. He does not turn to acknowledge the three-star general who has just stepped down into the damp entryway, dripping mud onto the top cellar step. He completely ignores General George S. Patton standing 3 paces behind him. Nearby runners freeze in place, holding their breath as they glance nervously between the corporal's bent neck and the commanding general's rigid jaw. Patton stands silently in the narrow doorway while the cellar vibrates from another brutal shockwave. What happened in the next 30 seconds would reveal the exact line between reckless insubordination and total tactical mastery. And the answer was not what anyone in that room was prepared for. If you want more untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button. It helps us bring these forgotten moments of courage and quiet leadership directly to you every single week. Let me back up a second, because to understand what it cost Corporal Theodore Palluck to ignore the most famous general in Europe, you need to understand what that wine cellar actually was. In March 1945, near the muddy banks of the Rhine at Oppenheim, a communications post was not a secure staff tent or a clean command bunker. It was a subterranean wine cellar beneath a shattered German house, smelling faintly of sour, fermented grapes, wet wool, and stale sweat. Plaster dust sifted down constantly from the wooden ceiling beams like fine grey snow, landing on maps, bare skin, and radio dials with every heavy German shell impact on the ground above. The air vibrated until teeth ached. Radios were balanced on improvised plank tables resting atop empty wooden wine barrels. Signal wire ran in crude tangles across damp stone floors. It was a cold, dark pressure cooker where men sat hunchbacked over buzzing headsets, breathing in heavy exhaust from idling generators outside while trying to filter human voices out of crackling static. In that environment, the unwritten rules of military rank were meant to be absolute. The distance between a 3-star commanding general and a 23-year-old corporal was an ocean. In Patton's Third Army, when the commanding general stepped through a doorway, protocol was not optional. Men snapped to attention. Eyeballs locked forward, voices stopped dead. The hierarchy demanded immediate and total deference, regardless of what was happening around you. To completely ignore an army commander 3 paces behind your back, to fail to turn your head, salute, or even blink was unthinkable. Every runner and clerk frozen along the damp stone wall was making the exact same mental calculation. They knew the consequences of insubordination. They knew Patton's legendary temper. They knew that failing to acknowledge 3 silver stars was a fast track to a disciplinary hearing. But the operational stakes along the river went far beyond military etiquette. The Rhine crossing was a massive, unforgiving arithmetic equation written in steel, fuel, and human lives. Across the water at Oppenheim, infantry regiments were clinging to a narrow bridgehead under relentless counter-battery fire. The tactical math was simple and brutal. A 5-second gap in a radio signal could delay an entire artillery battery from laying down defensive smoke. A single lost coordinate digit or a dropped receiver that severed the relay meant shells landing 200 yards off target, right into friendly foxholes instead of enemy armor. Every second lost on that radio set carried a measurable cost in men killed on the pontoon bridges and vehicles burning on the riverbank. The operational line could not afford a single interrupted second. And that was the room Theodore Palluck kept his head down in. Picture the scene inside that damp wine cellar near Oppenheim in March 1945. 8 men are packed into a subterranean stone space 6 feet beneath the churning earth. A pair of hanging kerosene lanterns flickers erratically against low brick arches, throwing long, fitful shadows across wet plaster walls. The air is dense with raw sulfur, damp earth, and the sharp tang of stale wine. Every 8 seconds, another heavy German shell detonates above ground. Dust rains down in steady grey curtains, landing on steel helmets, yellow pads, and bare shoulders. Through it all, Corporal Theodore Paluch sits fixed to his wooden seat, his knuckles white around his pencil, his body braced to absorb each concussion. Standing near the bottom stair, Private First Class Gene Leahy, a 20-year-old dispatch runner from Wilkes-Barre, froze solid. He was not watching the radio set. He was staring at the doorway, where General George S. Patton stood quietly, 3 paces behind the corporal's back. Every clerk and runner along the wall performed the exact same rapid calculation. They saw a low-ranking corporal actively ignoring the most formidable commander in the European theatre. They saw a general whose insistence on strict military hierarchy was absolute. Everyone braced for the inevitable blast of fury. Stay with me, because what happened next in that room is the part nobody was expecting. The accounts that survive from that subterranean cellar near Oppenheim are remarkably consistent in shape. They come from the runners and wiremen pinned against the damp masonry walls, men who watched the doorway with absolute dread. They all remembered the exact weight of the silence before anyone moved. General Patton did not roar, not the way a general looks at an act of open disrespect, not the way a commanding officer reacts when a low-ranking enlistee ignores his presence in the middle of an operation. He looked at Corporal Paluch's strained neck and steady hands the way he looked at a machine operating at maximum efficiency. Without saying a single word, Patton took one measured step backward onto the mud-slicked wooden stairs. He reached out with a heavy leather-gloved hand, grabbed the thick oak handle of the wine cellar door, and slowly pulled it shut until the latch clicked into place. He closed the entrance from the outside to shield the radio set and the operator from the incoming blast pressure. Inside the cellar, the sudden clack of the heavy wood against the stone frame echoed above the hum of the generator. Private First Class Gene Leahy, the 20-year-old dispatch runner from Wilkes-Barre, stood frozen near the bottom step, staring at the closed wooden panel in utter disbelief. He had braced for an explosion of command fury that never came. Outside, the general's heavy footsteps moved deliberate and quiet through the mud, heading back toward his command jeep without looking back. Lee later recalled that the silence left behind in that cellar was heavier than the artillery shell detonations outside. See, what most folks don't realize is that George S. Patton, for all his obsession with polished brass and rigid military discipline, understood a fundamental truth about tactical leadership. He recognized the difference between a breach of discipline and an act of total operational focus. In that wine cellar, Luke was not being disrespectful. He was acting as the critical nerve center for an entire army division attempting to secure a riverhead. The math in Patton's mind was immediate and precise. Had Patton interrupted Paluch to demand a salute or enforce protocol, the radio signal would have dropped. A 10-second lapse in target transmission meant artillery rounds falling blind, pontoon bridges shattered, and hundreds of infantrymen pinned on the exposed eastern bank of the Rhine. To Patton, protocol was a tool designed to produce combat efficiency, not a ritual to satisfy vanity. By pulling that heavy wooden door shut, Patton was not backing down from an inferior subordinate. He was actively defending the transmission line. He transformed himself in that brief fragment of a minute from an army commander into an obstacle shield for a single radio operator whose concentration was holding a bridgehead together. He saw a man doing his job with absolute single-minded mastery, and he got out of the way. Corporal Theodore Teddy Paluch was 23 years old, born and raised on Cedar Avenue in Scranton, Pennsylvania. His father was an anthracite mine phone operator who had lost most of his hearing from years of sharp mechanical clicks and localized cave-in concussions deep underground. From the time Teddy was 12, his father taught him how to read human voice vibrations through low-frequency static, how to stay steady on a hand-cranked line when the timber frames were shuddering, and how to hold a transmission without flinching. Before entering the army, Teddy worked as a switchboard repairman for the regional telephone company, spending long cold days tracing copper wire through rainstorms and coal dust. He was engaged to a girl named Martha, who worked at the Scranton Silk Mill, and her weekly letters carried simple details about quiet Sundays and saving up for a small 2-bedroom house near the iron works. Teddy had a clear, practical plan for after the war. Return to northeastern Pennsylvania, secure a steady job as a district lineman for the electric power company, and build a quiet life without ever touching a military radio again. Around his neck, underneath his heavy wool shirt, he wore a silver St. Christopher medal hanging from a piece of green paracord. his brother had cut from a supply parachute. He was not a romantic, he was not a hero, he was the kind of man who looked at a roaring, collapsing room and saw only a line of critical numbers that needed to reach the other side, unbroken. When the German artillery barrage finally slackened 2 hours later and another signal operator rotated into the cellar to take over the plank table, Private First Class Leahy leaned over and told Teddy that the officer who had stood in the doorway and pulled the heavy door shut was General Patton himself. Teddy did not drop his lead pencil. He did not jump up or run up the stairs to look down the muddy street. He simply reached into his collar, pulled the silver St. Christopher medal hanging from its green paracord out from under his shirt, and used his thumb to wipe away a fresh layer of grey plaster dust. He asked if the main line to the 3rd Battalion was still holding clear. When Leahy confirmed that the signal was solid, Teddy tucked the medal back into his shirt and picked up his logbook to check the next set of grid coordinates. Private First Class Gene Leahy, the 20-year-old dispatch runner from Wilkes-Barre who watched the entire encounter from the damp stone steps, survived the river crossing and the final push across Central Europe. After returning home from the war, Leahy spent 34 years working as a technician for the local municipal water district, raising a family just a few miles from the Susquehanna River. For decades, whenever veterans gathered at community halls to discuss Patton's formidable reputation and relentless drive, Leahy would tell the story of that plaster-dusted wine cellar near Oppenheim. He passed away in 2008 at the age of 83, leaving behind a quiet record of an army commander who knew when to step back and let a competent soldier complete his work. Was General Patton right to pull that heavy cellar door shut and walk away without saying a single word? Some would say it was a dangerous compromise of basic military protocol, allowing a junior corporal to completely ignore a 3-star army commander risks eroding the essential chain of command, setting a bad precedent where strict discipline becomes optional during the chaos of battle. Others would say exactly the opposite. They would argue that true tactical leadership requires recognizing the vital difference between rigid protocol and operational reality. In the brutal arithmetic of high-stakes combat, an uninterrupted radio relay saving lives on the riverbank mattered far more than a formal salute. By stepping back into the damp mud, Patton chose to protect the mission over his own authority. Let us know in the comments below, and if you want more untold stories from World War II, make sure you subscribe.